How to stop caring what people think without becoming cold. The psychology of approval, rejection, and emotional freedom. Introduction. The invisible audience controlling your life. Most people believe they are living freely. But if you observe carefully, you will notice something disturbing. Almost everyone is performing. Performing while speaking. Performing while posting online. Performing while dressing. Performing while expressing opinions. Performing while pretending not to care. Entire identities are being shaped around one silent psychological question: what will people think of me? This question controls more human behavior than most people realize. It controls careers. People choose relationships. People stay in dreams. People abandon opinions. People hide personalities. People create emotions. People suppress risks. People avoid. And perhaps the saddest part is this: many people never discover who they truly are beneath the performance. Because from a very young age, human beings learn something psychologically dangerous: acceptance feels necessary for survival. Long before modern society existed, belonging to a tribe meant protection, food, safety, connection, survival itself. Rejection from the group could mean death. Your nervous system still carries traces of that ancient survival programming today. That is why judgment feels emotionally intense. Why embarrassment feels unbearable. Why criticism can ruin an entire day. Why public humiliation feels physically painful. The nervous system interprets social rejection as danger, even when logically, no real physical threat exists. This is one of the most important truths about human psychology. People are not only afraid of failure, they are afraid of being seen failing. Because being judged threatens identity. And identity is emotionally tied to belonging. This fear shapes people quietly for years. A child raises their hand confidently once, and classmates laugh. Suddenly, self-expression becomes dangerous. Another child gets praised only when behaving perfectly. Now approval becomes emotional survival. Someone expresses emotion honestly, and gets rejected. Now vulnerability feels unsafe. Over time, people begin adapting themselves psychologically. Not based on authenticity, based on acceptance. This adaptation becomes performance. The likable personality. The successful image. The confident mask. The good child. The strong person. The socially acceptable version of the self. And eventually, many people become so disconnected from authenticity that they no longer know where the performance ends and the real self begins. This creates emotional exhaustion. Because performance requires constant monitoring, constant self-editing, constant emotional calculation. Should I say this? Will they judge me? What if I look stupid? What if they reject me? What if they stop liking me? The mind becomes trapped inside an invisible audience, even when nobody is truly paying that much attention. This is especially true in the modern world. Social media has transformed human psychology dramatically. People are no longer only experiencing life. They are presenting life, curating it, editing it, packaging identity for approval. Likes become emotional validation. Views become self-worth. Attention becomes identity reinforcement. And slowly, many people stop asking, "What do I genuinely feel?" and start asking, "What will be accepted?" This creates internal fragmentation. The authentic self gets buried beneath social survival strategies. People laugh when they are hurt, agree when they disagree, stay silent when they want to speak, pretend confidence while feeling insecure internally, pretend happiness while emotionally exhausted, pretend independence while craving validation desperately. This performance becomes so normalized that authenticity itself begins feeling dangerous. Because authenticity risks judgment, and judgment activates shame. This is why so many people struggle being fully themselves publicly. Not because they lack personality, because their nervous system associates authenticity with emotional risk. The fear of people's opinions becomes psychological imprisonment. Many individuals build entire lives around avoiding disapproval. They choose safety over truth, approval over authenticity, belonging over self-respect, and over time, something tragic happens. They lose connection with themselves. Because constantly shaping yourself around others' expectations slowly destroys inner clarity. You stop knowing what you truly believe, what you genuinely want, what actually fulfills you, what feelings are real, what parts of your personality are authentic. Everything becomes filtered through social perception. This is exhausting for the nervous system. Because human beings were never meant to live entirely as performances. The body feels this disconnection deeply. Anxiety increases. Overthinking increases. Social fear increases. Comparison increases. Emotional insecurity increases. Why? Because self-worth built on external approval is psychologically unstable. Other people's opinions constantly change. Crowds are inconsistent. Public approval is temporary. And if your identity depends entirely on outside validation, peace becomes impossible. You become emotionally controlled by perception. A prisoner of imagined judgment. This is why some people obsess over criticism for years. Why rejection feels catastrophic. Why social anxiety becomes paralyzing. Why embarrassing memories replay endlessly in the mind. The nervous system becomes hyper-focused on avoiding shame. Because shame threatens belonging. And belonging feels emotionally tied to survival. Understanding this changes everything. Because most people think they are too sensitive. But often, they are simply emotionally conditioned around approval. They learned. Being accepted keeps me safe. Being disliked makes me unsafe. My worth depends on how others see me. These beliefs become unconscious emotional rules. And unconscious rules control behavior powerfully. A person may never pursue their dream because they fear judgment. Never express love honestly because they fear rejection. Never speak authentically because they fear criticism. Never show vulnerability because they fear humiliation. The tragedy is not only emotional suffering. The tragedy is self-abandonment. Because every time you betray your truth for approval, the nervous system receives the message, other people's opinions matter more than my authentic self. Eventually, people become strangers to themselves internally. And yet, the solution is not becoming cold. Not becoming emotionally detached from humanity. Not pretending you never care what anyone thinks. That is another form of performance. Human beings naturally care about connection. Care about relationships. Care about acceptance to some degree. The goal is not emotional numbness. The goal is emotional freedom. The ability to hear opinions without becoming psychologically controlled by them. The ability to handle criticism without identity collapse. The ability to be disliked without self-destruction. The ability to live authentically even when approval is uncertain. That is real confidence. Not arrogance. Not superiority. Internal groundedness. The kind that says, I respect myself enough to remain honest, even if not everyone approves. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid judgment completely. But freedom begins when you realize something powerful. No matter what you do, someone will misunderstand you. Someone will dislike you. Someone will judge you unfairly. And once you stop trying to control everyone's perception, you finally begin reclaiming your life. This book is about that transformation. Not becoming careless. Not becoming emotionally disconnected. But becoming internally stable enough that other people's opinions stop controlling your identity. Because perhaps the greatest prison in modern life is not rejection itself. It is the fear of rejection controlling who you become. Chapter 1. The childhood origin of people-pleasing. Nobody is born afraid of disappointing everyone. Children are born emotionally honest. They cry when hurt. Laugh when joyful. Express emotions openly. Speak without carefully editing every word. But slowly, many children begin learning a dangerous emotional lesson. Being loved depends on how acceptable I am to others. That lesson changes personality completely. For some children, love felt conditional. They were praised when obedient, accepted when quiet, rewarded when useful, noticed when successful. But when emotional needs appeared, attention disappeared. When anger appeared, punishment arrived. When individuality appeared, criticism followed. So the nervous system adapted. The child unconsciously learned. To stay emotionally safe, I must become who others want me to be. This is where people-pleasing begins. Not from kindness alone. From emotional survival. Many people-pleasers were once emotionally sensitive children trying desperately to avoid rejection. Trying to avoid conflict. Avoid disappointment. Avoid emotional abandonment. So they became hyper-aware of others' moods. Reading facial expressions constantly. Monitoring tone changes. Trying to keep everyone emotionally comfortable. The child becomes the good one, the responsible one, the peacekeeper, the helper. The emotionally mature child, but underneath the helpfulness is often fear. Fear that love disappears if approval disappears. This creates emotional conditioning. The nervous system begins associating self-worth with pleasing others. And eventually, the child stops asking, "What do I feel?" and starts asking, "What will make others accept me?" That shift disconnects people from themselves psychologically. Because authenticity becomes risky. The real self may be too emotional, too difficult, too needy, too different. So performance begins. A socially acceptable personality forms. And the tragic part is this: many people-pleasers become deeply liked by others, while feeling emotionally invisible internally. Because people love the version of them designed for approval, not necessarily the authentic self underneath it. This creates hidden loneliness. The person constantly gives emotional energy to everyone else, while secretly feeling unseen themselves. Because relationships built entirely around pleasing often lack true emotional intimacy, the people-pleaser becomes addicted to being needed. Needed feels safer than honestly known. This continues into adulthood. The adult people-pleaser struggles, saying no, expressing disagreement, setting boundaries, disappointing people, asking for needs, handling criticism. Why? Because the nervous system still believes conflict threatens connection, disapproval threatens safety, rejection threatens worth. Even healthy disagreement feels emotionally dangerous. The body reacts with anxiety. Guilt appears immediately. Fear appears instantly. This is why many people betray themselves repeatedly to maintain external peace. They tolerate disrespect, overextend themselves, suppress emotions, remain in unhealthy relationships, avoid honesty. Not because they lack intelligence. Because the nervous system was conditioned around approval-based survival. And perhaps the saddest part is this: many people-pleasers do not even realize they are abandoning themselves. Because self-sacrifice became identity. Helping everyone became self-worth. Being easy to love became emotional protection. But eventually, emotional exhaustion appears. Resentment appears. Burnout appears. Because no human being can permanently survive through self-erasure, the nervous system becomes overwhelmed. The person begins feeling emotionally drained, disconnected, unseen, unappreciated, quietly angry, secretly empty. Not because kindness is wrong. Because constant self-abandonment destroys inner stability. True kindness does not require self-destruction. But many people were never taught that. They were taught good people sacrifice themselves endlessly. So guilt becomes automatic whenever they prioritize themselves. This guilt is deeply psychological. Because boundaries threaten the identity built around approval. The moment the people-pleaser says no, the nervous system panics. What if they leave? What if they become angry? What if I disappoint them? What if they stop loving me? The fear is not only about the present moment. It is connected to older emotional conditioning. This is why healing people-pleasing requires nervous system healing. Not just communication skills, The body itself must learn, I can disappoint people and still be worthy. Conflict does not equal abandonment. My needs matter too. Love that requires self-erasure is not healthy love. These lessons transform identity slowly. The people pleaser begins reconnecting with themselves emotionally. Learning what they truly want, what they genuinely feel, what boundaries protect peace, what relationships feel emotionally safe. This process often feels uncomfortable initially, because authenticity risks disapproval, and disapproval once felt emotionally dangerous. But healing requires tolerating temporary discomfort instead of lifelong self-abandonment. That is emotional growth. Not becoming selfish, becoming honest. Because emotionally healthy people do not constantly shape-shift for approval. They remain respectful, without disappearing themselves. And perhaps the most important realization of all is this: people-pleasing is not proof of kindness. Often, it is proof that the nervous system learned love had to be earned. Chapter 2. Why rejection feels like death. One of the most painful experiences a human being can feel is rejection. Not physical pain. Not failure. Rejection. Being ignored, excluded, dismissed, unwanted, unchosen, unloved. Most people underestimate how psychologically powerful rejection truly is. Because rejection does not only hurt emotions, it threatens identity. And the nervous system reacts to that threat intensely. This is why a breakup can feel physically unbearable. Why criticism can destroy someone's confidence for years. Why social humiliation can replay endlessly in the mind. Why being excluded from a group can trigger emotional collapse. The body interprets rejection as danger, even when no physical threat exists. This reaction is ancient. Long before modern society, human survival depended on belonging to groups. Being accepted by the tribe meant protection, food, safety, survival. Being rejected could mean isolation. And isolation once meant death. Your nervous system still carries traces of this survival programming today. That is why rejection feels disproportionately painful sometimes. The body reacts as if something life-threatening happened emotionally. This is not weakness. It is biology mixed with emotional conditioning. Modern neuroscience even shows that social rejection activates similar brain regions involved in physical pain. The nervous system experiences emotional exclusion as a real threat. This explains why phrases like, "I felt crushed," "it broke me," "it hurt physically," are psychologically accurate. Rejection creates real emotional suffering inside the body. But rejection becomes even more painful when childhood wounds already exist. Because present rejection often activates older emotional memories underneath it. A person ignored by a romantic partner may unconsciously relive childhood emotional neglect. Criticism may reactivate old shame. Abandonment may awaken deep fears of being unlovable. This is why some people react to rejection with overwhelming intensity. The reaction is not only about the present moment. It is connected to accumulated emotional history. For example, two people experience the same breakup. One feels sadness but eventually heals. The other experiences emotional devastation, obsession, panic, and identity collapse. Why? Because the rejection activated deeper wounds already living inside the nervous system. Wounds like, "I am not enough," "people always leave," "I am unlovable," "I will always be abandoned," "something is wrong with me." These beliefs often form early in life through repeated emotional experiences. Children naturally personalize rejection. A child emotionally neglected does not think, "My parents are emotionally unavailable." The child thinks, "Something must be wrong with me." This creates shame-based identity. And shame changes how rejection is experienced later in life. Because rejection no longer feels like, "This situation did not work." It feels like, "I am fundamentally unworthy." That distinction changes everything psychologically. Healthy self-worth allows rejection to remain situational. Fragile self-worth turns rejection into identity destruction. This is why emotionally insecure people often become obsessed with approval. Approval temporarily protects them from shame. Validation becomes emotional survival. Without it, old wounds reactivate. This creates dangerous emotional dependency. The person becomes terrified of criticism, embarrassment, conflict, disapproval, abandonment, public failure, not because they are weak. Because rejection activates emotional survival fears. This fear shapes behavior constantly. Many people stay silent to avoid judgment, hide opinions to avoid criticism, tolerate unhealthy relationships to avoid loneliness, avoid risks to avoid humiliation, suppress authenticity to maintain acceptance. The nervous system chooses emotional safety over truth, even when the safety slowly destroys self-respect internally. This becomes especially visible in romantic relationships. People often remain attached to individuals hurting them emotionally because rejection feels more terrifying than suffering. The mind says, "At least I am not alone. At least someone wants me. Losing them would destroy me." This fear creates emotional attachment rooted in survival, not love. The person tolerates disrespect because abandonment feels unbearable. Why? Because the nervous system associates rejection with emotional annihilation. This also explains social anxiety powerfully. Social anxiety is not merely shyness. It is heightened fear of negative social judgment. The nervous system becomes hyper-aware of facial expressions, tone changes, embarrassment, possible criticism, public mistakes, social rejection. The person overthinks constantly. Did I sound stupid? Do they dislike me? What if I embarrass myself? What if they judge me? The mind becomes trapped in social threat monitoring. Not because people are obsessed with themselves. Because the nervous system fears exclusion. And modern social media intensifies this fear dramatically. People now experience rejection publicly, ignored messages, low engagement, exclusion from online spaces, criticism from strangers, comparison culture. Validation becomes visible numerically: likes, followers, views, comments. This creates emotional instability for many people. Because identity becomes connected to public reaction, the person unconsciously asks, "How valuable am I socially?" through digital approval metrics. And when approval decreases, self-worth often decreases with it. This creates emotional fragility. Because external validation is unpredictable, no human being can maintain stable self-worth while emotionally depending entirely on public approval. That is why emotionally grounded people process rejection differently. Not because rejection never hurts them. Because rejection does not define their identity completely. They understand. Being rejected does not mean I am worthless. Not everyone will understand me. Disapproval is part of being authentic. Another person's inability to value me does not erase my value. This mindset creates resilience, not emotional numbness. Resilience. The ability to survive rejection without self-destruction. That ability changes life profoundly. Because eventually, emotionally healthy people realize something powerful: rejection is unavoidable. No matter how attractive you are, someone will reject you. No matter how talented you are, someone will criticize you. No matter how kind you are, someone will misunderstand you. Trying to avoid rejection completely means trying to avoid being human. And people who fear rejection excessively often stop living authentically altogether. They become performers instead of people. Careful, edited, emotionally restricted. But authenticity always risks disapproval. Always. That is the price of honesty. The moment you stop performing constantly, some people will dislike the real you. And that truth terrifies many individuals. But here is the deeper truth. Being rejected for who you truly are is far less painful than being accepted for someone you are pretending to be. Because false acceptance creates hidden loneliness. People love the mask, while the real self remains unseen. Healing rejection wounds requires rebuilding self-worth internally. Not through endless validation, but through self-connection. The nervous system must slowly learn. Rejection is painful, but survivable. Disapproval does not erase my worth. I do not need universal acceptance to deserve love. Other people's opinions cannot define my humanity. These realizations create emotional freedom. Not freedom from pain. Freedom from emotional imprisonment. Because perhaps the deepest psychological trap in life is this: many people are not controlled by rejection itself. They are controlled by the fear of rejection long before rejection even happens. Chapter 3. The addiction to validation. Most people believe they want success. But psychologically, many people want something deeper than success. They want validation. To feel seen, approved of, admired, chosen, important. Because validation temporarily silences one of the deepest human fears: maybe I am not enough. This is why praise can feel emotionally intoxicating. Why compliments create emotional highs. Why attention feels powerful. Why approval becomes addictive. Validation does not only affect the mind. It affects the nervous system chemically. Every notification, every compliment, every social approval signal, the brain releases dopamine, a neurotransmitter associated with reward and anticipation. This creates a dangerous psychological cycle. The person feels emotionally elevated through external approval. Then the feeling fades. And the nervous system wants more. More praise. More attention. More recognition. More proof of worth. This is how validation becomes addiction. Not because attention itself is evil. Because the nervous system starts depending on it emotionally. This dependency is everywhere in modern life. Social media amplified it dramatically. Human beings are now exposed to constant public evaluation. Likes, views, followers, comments, shares. Identity becomes measurable, and slowly, many people stop experiencing life naturally. They begin performing life for approval. A meal is not only eaten. It is photographed. An experience is not only lived. It is presented. A feeling is not only felt. It is curated publicly. The mind unconsciously asks, how will this make me appear? This creates emotional fragmentation. The authentic self becomes secondary to the performative self. And over time, people lose touch with their own internal experience. Because their attention constantly moves outward. Toward reaction. Toward applause. Toward validation. This becomes psychologically exhausting. Because external approval is unstable. One day people praise you. Another day they ignore you. And if your self-worth depends entirely on public reaction, your emotional state becomes fragile. This explains why many people secretly feel anxious despite appearing successful. Their identity is externally regulated. Meaning, they feel valuable when validated, and worthless when ignored. This creates emotional volatility. The person becomes trapped in endless self-monitoring. How many people liked it? What do they think of me? Why did they not respond? Am I losing relevance? Am I enough? The nervous system becomes addicted to social confirmation. And silence starts feeling emotionally threatening. This is why criticism feels devastating to validation-dependent people. Because criticism does not only challenge behavior. It threatens identity. A single negative comment can overpower hundreds of compliments psychologically. Why? Because insecure nervous systems prioritize threat detection. The brain focuses on what threatens worth. This creates obsessive overthinking. The person replays criticism repeatedly, trying to protect identity, trying to repair emotional security. This addiction to validation often begins in childhood, especially in environments where love felt conditional. Children praised only for achievement, appearance, obedience, success, perfection, often grow into adults emotionally dependent on external approval. Because they learned, I receive love when I perform well. Performance becomes emotional survival. Without praise, they feel invisible. Without achievement, they feel unworthy. Without recognition, they feel emotionally unsafe. This creates high-functioning insecurity. The person may appear confident externally, while secretly terrified of failure internally. Many ambitious individuals operate from this psychology. They become addicted to achievement not only for success, but for emotional worth. The goal is not merely accomplishment. The goal is relief. Relief from inadequacy. Relief from shame. Relief from feeling not enough. But validation never fully heals insecurity. Because external praise cannot permanently repair internal wounds, the relief always fades. And eventually, the nervous system needs another achievement, another compliment, another audience, another source of approval. This is emotional dependency disguised as ambition. The person becomes trapped in endless proving, always trying to earn enough worth to finally feel complete. But no amount of applause creates permanent self-worth. Because self-worth built externally is unstable by nature. This is why many celebrities, influencers, and highly successful people still feel deeply insecure internally. Public admiration does not automatically create internal peace. Sometimes it intensifies insecurity. Because now identity depends even more heavily on public perception. The person fears losing relevance, losing admiration, disappointing others, appearing imperfect, being forgotten. Success becomes emotionally fragile, and eventually, exhaustion appears. Because performing for validation constantly drains the nervous system, the person loses connection with authenticity. They stop asking, "What genuinely fulfills me?" and begin asking, "What receives approval?" This creates internal emptiness. Even surrounded by attention, even surrounded by praise. Because attention is not the same as connection, and admiration is not the same as self-worth. Real self-worth feels different psychologically. It is quieter, more stable, less dependent on external reaction. A person with internal self-worth still appreciates praise, but does not emotionally collapse without it. They enjoy recognition, without needing it for identity survival. This creates emotional freedom. Because validation no longer controls their nervous system completely. This does not mean becoming emotionally cold, or pretending opinions never matter. Human beings naturally care about connection. The problem begins when connection becomes dependency. When approval becomes identity. That is when emotional imprisonment begins. Freedom requires slowly rebuilding worth internally. The nervous system must learn, my value is not determined by constant applause. Silence does not erase my worth. I do not need universal admiration to deserve respect. Being unseen sometimes does not make me insignificant. These lessons change identity profoundly. Because eventually, emotionally healthy people stop performing constantly. They stop shaping every action around possible approval. They become more honest, more grounded, more internally stable, and something surprising happens. The less desperate someone becomes for validation, the more authentic confidence they develop naturally. Because desperation weakens presence, internal security strengthens it. This is why truly confident people often feel calm. They are not constantly trying to prove themselves emotionally. They are not begging silently for approval through performance. Their identity is less dependent on external reaction. That stability creates peace. And perhaps the deepest realization of all is this: validation feels powerful because it temporarily fills emotional emptiness. But real healing begins when your worth no longer disappears in the absence of applause. Chapter 4. The personality you created to be accepted. Most people believe personality is entirely natural. But much of personality is adaptation. A psychological strategy built for survival, approval, and emotional safety. If you look closely, you will notice something disturbing. Many people are not expressing themselves. They are managing perception, carefully adjusting tone, behavior, opinions, emotions, body language, identity itself. All around one unconscious goal: stay accepted. Avoid rejection. Remain emotionally safe. This performance often begins in childhood. A child enters the world authentic. Loud when excited. Sensitive when hurt. Curious without shame. Emotionally honest. But eventually, the child begins receiving social feedback. Some traits are rewarded. Others are criticized. Some emotions receive comfort. Others receive punishment or rejection. And slowly, the nervous system starts making unconscious calculations. Which version of me gets accepted? Which version of me gets rejected? This is the birth of the social mask. A personality shaped not only by authenticity, but by emotional survival. For example, a child criticized for being emotional may become emotionally detached. A child rejected for confidence may become quiet and self-doubting. A child praised for achievement may become perfectionistic. A child raised around conflict may become hyper-agreeable. A child forced to be strong may suppress vulnerability entirely. Over time, adaptation becomes identity. The person no longer knows, am I truly like this? Or did I become this to survive emotionally? This question is deeply uncomfortable. Because many personalities are partially constructed around approval. The funny person may use humor to avoid vulnerability. The strong person may fear emotional exposure. The nice person may secretly fear abandonment. The independent person may fear needing anyone. The successful person may fear worthlessness. The confident person may secretly feel inadequate. What appears as personality externally often contains hidden emotional protection internally. This is why so many people feel emotionally exhausted socially. Because maintaining a socially acceptable identity requires constant nervous system monitoring. The person becomes hyper-aware of reactions. Judgment, approval, rejection, perception, emotional risk. Nothing feels fully natural. Everything becomes performance management. This creates identity fragmentation. The authentic self and the performative self begin separating psychologically. And eventually, the person loses connection with who they actually are. This is why many individuals secretly feel empty despite being socially liked. People admire the performance, while the real self remains hidden. That hidden self often carries unspoken opinions, unmet emotional needs, suppressed emotions, hidden desires, buried authenticity. But authenticity feels dangerous. Because authenticity risks rejection, so the nervous system stays attached to performance. Even when the performance creates suffering. This becomes especially visible in social environments. Many people enter rooms already emotionally acting, adjusting personality depending on who is present, who has power, who may judge them, who may reject them. Different mask for different audience. One personality with friends, another online, another with family, another at work, another in relationships. The person shape shifts psychologically, trying to remain acceptable everywhere. And eventually, exhaustion appears. Because no human being can permanently survive disconnected from authenticity. The nervous system becomes overwhelmed. Anxiety increases. Overthinking increases. Social fear increases. Why? Because performing constantly creates internal tension. The body feels the disconnection. This explains why many socially successful people still feel lonely internally. Because connection built on performance never feels completely safe. The person secretly fears. If people saw the real me, would they still stay? This fear creates hidden emotional isolation. The individual may receive attention, while still feeling unseen. Praised, while feeling emotionally unknown. Because masks attract approval, but they block intimacy. Real intimacy requires authenticity. And authenticity requires risk. The risk of disapproval, misunderstanding, judgment, rejection. Many people avoid this risk for years. Instead, they become experts at emotional editing. Saying what sounds acceptable. Feeling what feels socially safe. Suppressing what may create rejection. But self-suppression always has consequences psychologically. Eventually, resentment appears, emotional numbness appears, burnout appears, identity confusion appears. Because the authentic self cannot disappear completely. It waits underneath the performance, waiting to breathe again. This becomes especially painful in adulthood. A person may suddenly realize, I do not know who I actually am. I only know who people expect me to be. That realization can feel terrifying. Because many people built entire lives around external approval. Careers, relationships, identities, personalities, all shaped around acceptance, not truth. This is why authenticity feels emotionally dangerous initially. The nervous system associates it with social risk. Speaking honestly may create conflict. Setting boundaries may disappoint people. Showing vulnerability may invite judgment. Being different may create exclusion. So the body resists authenticity automatically. Not because authenticity is wrong. Because survival conditioning still exists. Healing requires slowly separating identity from performance. The person begins asking, what do I genuinely believe? What do I truly want? What emotions do I suppress? Which parts of me exist only for approval? Who am I without performance? These questions reconnect people with themselves emotionally. And this process changes everything. Because emotionally healthy people do not need to become different around every audience. They remain adaptable, without abandoning themselves. That is the difference between social intelligence and self-erasure. One maintains connection while staying authentic. The other sacrifices authenticity for acceptance. True confidence is not becoming universally liked. It is remaining internally honest even when approval is uncertain. That honesty creates emotional stability. Because eventually, the nervous system learns, I can survive disapproval. I do not need to perform constantly to deserve connection. The real self is not something I must hide to be worthy. These beliefs create psychological freedom. Not freedom from judgment. Freedom from emotional imprisonment. Because perhaps the most painful loneliness in life is not being rejected by others. It is becoming disconnected from yourself while trying to be accepted by everyone else. Chapter 5. Why criticism controls you emotionally. A single sentence can ruin someone's entire day. Sometimes, entire year. One comment. One rejection. One insult. One moment of disapproval. And suddenly, confidence collapses. The mind replays the words endlessly. Maybe they are right. Maybe I am not good enough. Maybe everyone secretly thinks this about me. Most people do not realize how psychologically powerful criticism truly is. Because criticism does not only challenge behavior. It threatens identity. Especially identities built around approval. This is why some people can receive 100 compliments and still obsess over one negative opinion. The nervous system prioritizes threat detection, not praise. Threat and criticism feels threatening because it activates shame. The fear of being exposed as inadequate, unworthy, embarrassing, weak, unlovable. This reaction often begins long before adulthood. Many people grew up in environments where mistakes felt emotionally dangerous. Criticism was not constructive. It was humiliating, mocking, harsh, punishing, emotionally unsafe. A child repeatedly criticized may begin internalizing a painful belief. If I make mistakes, I lose love. If I fail, I become unacceptable. This creates perfectionistic survival patterns. The nervous system becomes hyper-focused on avoiding judgment. Not because the person wants excellence alone. Because mistakes feel emotionally threatening. This is why perfectionists often struggle receiving feedback. Even gentle criticism activates deep nervous system distress. The reaction is rarely only about the present moment. It is connected to older emotional conditioning. For example, a manager gives constructive advice at work. One employee processes it calmly. Another spirals into anxiety and self-hatred. Why? Because the criticism triggered older shame wounds already living inside the nervous system. The mind unconsciously hears, "You are failing. You are not enough. You are disappointing. You are being rejected." This explains why emotionally insecure people often become defensive quickly. Defensiveness is psychological self-protection. The nervous system tries to protect identity from emotional pain. Some people react through anger. Others through withdrawal. Others through over-explaining. Others through self-attack. Different reactions. Same underlying fear. My worth is being threatened. Criticism becomes especially painful when identity depends heavily on external validation. If someone built their self-worth around being intelligent, being attractive, being successful, being kind, being admired, being competent, then criticism in those areas feels emotionally catastrophic. Why? Because fragile identity cannot tolerate contradiction. The nervous system interprets criticism as identity collapse. This creates emotional instability. The person becomes controlled by others' opinions. A compliment creates confidence. A criticism destroys it. This is emotional dependency. The self becomes externally regulated. And external regulation creates psychological fragility. This is why many people fear visibility itself. They want success, but fear criticism. Want attention, but fear judgment. Want authenticity, but fear disapproval. Because visibility increases exposure, and exposure increases the possibility of criticism. This creates self-sabotage. People stay small to avoid judgment, hide talents to avoid scrutiny, suppress opinions to avoid conflict, avoid opportunities to avoid failure publicly. The nervous system chooses emotional safety over growth, even when the safety slowly becomes imprisonment. Social media intensifies this dramatically. Human beings now receive criticism publicly from strangers. Comments, opinions, comparisons, mockery. The nervous system was never designed for constant public evaluation. This is why online criticism feels disproportionately painful sometimes. The brain interprets public judgment as social threat. And shame thrives under visibility. Many people pretend criticism does not affect them. But emotionally, most humans are affected by judgment to some degree. The difference is not whether criticism hurts. The difference is how deeply identity depends on external approval. Emotionally grounded people still feel criticism emotionally. But they do not collapse into self-destruction. Why? Because they separate behavior from identity, mistakes from worth, opinions from truth. This separation creates resilience. For example, "I made a mistake" is psychologically healthier than "I am a failure." One addresses behavior, the other attacks identity. This distinction changes emotional processing completely. Unfortunately, many people were never taught this separation. They were taught conditional worth. Praised when successful, criticized when imperfect. So they internalized, "My value depends on performance." This creates constant nervous system pressure. The person becomes terrified of failure, embarrassment, looking foolish, disappointing others, appearing imperfect. Perfection becomes emotional armor. But perfectionism is exhausting, because no human being can permanently avoid criticism. No matter how talented you are, someone will disapprove. No matter how attractive you are, someone will judge you. No matter how successful you are, someone will criticize you. Trying to become universally approved is psychologically impossible. Yet many people spend years attempting exactly that. And eventually, they lose themselves. Because constant self-monitoring disconnects people from authenticity. The person stops asking, "What do I believe?" and starts asking, "What will avoid criticism?" This creates emotional paralysis. Creativity suffers. Confidence weakens. Authenticity disappears. Because fear controls expression. Healing begins when someone realizes something powerful: criticism is unavoidable. But emotional collapse is not. This changes everything psychologically. Because emotionally strong people do not become fearless. They become internally grounded. They understand. Not every opinion deserves authority over my identity. Disapproval does not erase my worth. I can learn from criticism without hating myself. Being imperfect does not make me unworthy of respect. These beliefs create emotional stability. Not arrogance. Not defensiveness. Stability. The kind that allows reflection without self-destruction. This is important because not all criticism is harmful. Some criticism contains truth. Growth requires humility. But emotionally mature people evaluate criticism consciously instead of absorbing it automatically. They ask, is this feedback accurate? Is this person projecting? Is this criticism constructive or destructive? What can I learn without attacking my identity? This creates emotional intelligence. Without it, people either collapse under criticism or reject all feedback defensively. Neither creates growth. Real confidence holds both self-respect and self-awareness simultaneously. And perhaps the deepest realization of all is this. Criticism becomes emotionally devastating when your identity depends entirely on being perceived as perfect. Chapter 6. The fear of being truly seen. One of the deepest human fears is not failure. It is exposure. The fear that someone might truly see you and decide you are not enough. This fear shapes countless lives silently. People hide parts of themselves constantly, emotions, insecurities, desires, flaws, opinions, vulnerabilities, pain. Not because they are dishonest. Because being emotionally exposed feels dangerous. Most people want connection deeply. But at the same time, they fear what real connection requires, authenticity. Because authenticity risks rejection, and rejection threatens identity. This creates one of the greatest psychological conflicts in human life, the desire to be fully seen, while simultaneously fearing being fully known. Many people spend years performing carefully constructed versions of themselves. Confident, successful, funny, strong, independent, unbothered. But underneath the performance often exists another reality entirely. Fear, shame, loneliness, insecurity, emotional exhaustion. The person secretly wonders, if people saw the real me, would they still love me? This question lives quietly inside millions of nervous systems, especially in people who learned early that vulnerability was unsafe. A child mocked for emotions learns to hide sensitivity. A child rejected for honesty learns to perform. A child criticized constantly learns to conceal imperfection. A child emotionally abandoned learns, my authentic needs are dangerous. So the nervous system adapts. Masks develop psychologically, not fake personalities exactly, protective identities. Emotional armor. The strong person may secretly fear being emotionally weak. The funny person may hide pain through humor. The independent person may fear needing anyone. The confident person may secretly feel inadequate. The cold person may actually fear emotional closeness deeply. What appears emotionally distant externally often hides vulnerability internally. This is important to understand. Many people are not hiding because they are manipulative. They are hiding because they are afraid. Afraid of judgment, rejection, abandonment, humiliation, emotional exposure. Because emotional exposure activates shame. And shame is one of the most painful emotions humans experience. Shame says, something is wrong with me. If people truly know me, they will leave. I must hide parts of myself to remain lovable. This belief changes behavior profoundly. The person becomes emotionally edited, careful, controlled, performative, not fully honest, not fully relaxed, always monitoring perception. This creates chronic nervous system tension. Because hiding requires energy. The body never fully relaxes when authenticity feels unsafe. This explains why many people feel exhausted socially. Not because interaction itself is tiring. Because performance is tiring. The constant self-monitoring. How do I appear? Am I embarrassing myself? Do they still like me? Should I hide this part of myself? The nervous system becomes trapped in impression management. This becomes especially visible in social anxiety. Many people think social anxiety is fear of people. Often, it is fear of negative evaluation, fear of exposure, fear of humiliation, fear of being seen imperfectly. The anxious person enters social situations hyper-aware of themselves, monitoring facial expressions, body language, speech, awkwardness, reactions from others. Why? Because the nervous system interprets social mistakes as emotional danger. The person fears, what if they see something unacceptable in me? This creates emotional inhibition. The individual becomes quieter, smaller, more cautious. Not because they lack personality. Because authenticity feels psychologically risky. Social media intensified this dramatically. Human beings now exist inside constant visibility. Every opinion can be judged publicly. Every mistake recorded. Every flaw criticized. This creates performance culture. People curate identities carefully, showing success, beauty, confidence, happiness, achievement while hiding insecurity, loneliness, confusion, fear. Emotional struggle. The result is collective emotional disconnection. Everyone performing strength. Few feeling truly seen. And yet, despite all this performance, the human nervous system still craves authenticity deeply. Why? Because real connection only happens when masks weaken. No one feels deeply loved while fully performing. Because performance attracts approval, not intimacy. Intimacy requires emotional risk. The willingness to say, this is who I really am, even when acceptance is uncertain. This is terrifying for many people, especially those with rejection wounds. Because vulnerability creates exposure, and exposure removes emotional control. The person cannot guarantee acceptance anymore. This is why many individuals prefer emotional distance unconsciously. Distance feels safer than vulnerability. Control feels safer than openness. Detachment feels safer than emotional risk. But emotional protection has consequences. The more someone hides themselves, the lonelier they often become internally. Because the nervous system knows, nobody truly knows me. This creates invisible isolation. Even surrounded by people, even admired publicly, even loved externally. The authentic self remains emotionally hidden. Healing begins when someone slowly learns, I do not need to earn love through perfection. Being human does not make me unworthy. Vulnerability is not weakness. I can survive being seen honestly. These beliefs transform relationships. The nervous system slowly stops treating authenticity like danger. The person begins expressing emotions honestly, admitting fears, speaking truthfully, setting boundaries, showing imperfection, allowing themselves to be emotionally real. This does not mean oversharing with everyone. Emotional maturity still requires discernment. Not every person deserves full vulnerability. But emotionally healthy people stop hiding themselves compulsively. They stop building identity entirely around performance. And something powerful happens. The more authentic someone becomes, the calmer the nervous system often feels. Why? Because internal conflict decreases. The performative self and authentic self begin reconnecting. The person no longer spends every moment managing perception. This creates emotional freedom. Not freedom from judgment, freedom from self-erasure. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this. The fear of being truly seen often comes from the belief that the real self is unlovable. Healing begins the moment you stop treating your humanity like something that must be hidden to deserve connection. Chapter 7. Confidence without arrogance. Most people misunderstand confidence. They think confidence means dominating rooms, speaking loudly, never doubting yourself, appearing emotionally unaffected, always looking powerful. But much of what society calls confidence is actually performance. Sometimes insecurity wearing expensive clothing. Sometimes fear hidden behind superiority. Sometimes emotional fragility disguised as ego. Real confidence feels very different psychologically. It is quieter, calmer, less desperate for attention, less obsessed with proving worth constantly. Because true confidence is not built on superiority over others. It is built on internal stability. The ability to remain connected to yourself regardless of external approval. This is why genuinely confident people often do not need to announce their confidence repeatedly. They are not fighting internally for worth every moment. They do not need constant validation to feel valuable. And perhaps most importantly, real confidence does not require becoming emotionally cold. Many people believe the only way to stop caring what others think is to become detached, arrogant, or emotionally unavailable. So they build emotional armor. Pretending nothing affects them, nobody matters. Emotions are weakness. Vulnerability is dangerous, but this is not confidence. It is protection. Usually created after emotional pain. A person rejected deeply may become emotionally distant. A person humiliated repeatedly may become defensive and arrogant. A person betrayed may suppress vulnerability entirely. The nervous system says, if I stop caring completely, nobody can hurt me. But emotional numbness is not freedom. It is disconnection. Real confidence still allows empathy, connection, vulnerability, emotional depth, compassion. The difference is this: confident people feel emotions without becoming controlled by external opinions constantly. That internal groundedness changes behavior profoundly. For example, an insecure person often enters rooms psychologically asking, do they approve of me? A confident person enters asking, do I feel aligned with myself here? One seeks validation externally, the other remains connected internally. This distinction changes relationships, communication, and identity itself. Many insecure people unconsciously shape their personalities around approval, agreeing constantly, performing constantly, trying to impress constantly. Why? Because they fear disapproval emotionally. Their nervous system associates rejection with worthlessness. But confidence weakens this dependency. The person slowly realizes, not everyone needs to like me for me to respect myself. That realization is life-changing. Because people addicted to approval often become emotionally exhausted, always monitoring reactions, always adjusting personality, always trying to avoid criticism. This creates chronic anxiety. Confidence interrupts this cycle, not through arrogance, through self-trust. Self-trust means, even if I am misunderstood, I can survive it. Even if someone dislikes me, my worth remains intact. Even if I fail publicly, I remain human and valuable. This creates emotional resilience. Not perfection. Resilience. The ability to tolerate discomfort without identity collapse. Many people confuse confidence with ego because both can appear strong externally. But psychologically, they are completely different. Ego says, I must appear superior. Confidence says, I do not need to prove superiority. Ego fears criticism deeply. Confidence can tolerate it. Ego depends on comparison. Confidence does not require constant comparison to exist. Ego performs power. Confidence embodies calmness. This is why truly confident people rarely need to dominate others emotionally. They are not desperately protecting fragile identity. Insecure people often seek power through attention, control, status, admiration, intimidation. Because external power temporarily hides internal insecurity. But the relief never lasts. Why? Because insecurity cannot be permanently solved through performance. Real confidence requires internal work. The nervous system must slowly stop depending entirely on external validation. This process often feels uncomfortable initially. Because many people build identity around approval. Without approval, they feel emotionally lost. The mind asks, who am I if people stop praising me? Who am I without performance? Who am I without external validation? These questions are psychologically important. Because confidence grows when identity reconnects with authenticity. Not perfection. Authenticity. The person stops trying to become universally admired, and starts becoming internally honest. This honesty creates peace. Because performing constantly is exhausting. Trying to impress everyone is impossible. Trying to avoid criticism forever is psychologically destructive. Eventually, emotionally healthy people realize, some people will misunderstand me. Some people will dislike me. Some people will judge me unfairly. And none of those things erase their humanity. This creates freedom. Not freedom from pain. Freedom from emotional dependency. The confident person still cares about people. Still values relationships. Still appreciates respect and connection. But they no longer sacrifice themselves completely for approval. This changes boundaries profoundly. A confident person can say, "I respect you. But I will not abandon myself to keep you comfortable." That sentence represents emotional maturity. Because insecure people often confuse self-sacrifice with kindness. But confidence understands. Respecting yourself is not selfish. It is necessary. This also changes how emotionally confident people handle mistakes. Insecure individuals often experience failure as identity collapse. A mistake becomes, "I am worthless." Confident people separate behavior from identity. They think, "I failed at something," not, "I am a failure." This distinction protects emotional stability. Because perfection is impossible. And identities built on perfection always become fragile eventually. Confidence allows imperfection without self-hatred. That is psychological strength. Not pretending to be flawless. Accepting humanity without shame. This is why confident people often feel emotionally safe to others. They are not constantly competing. Not constantly proving. Not constantly seeking superiority. Their nervous system is calmer. More grounded. More authentic. And authenticity creates presence stronger than performance ever could. Perhaps the deepest truth about confidence is this: confidence is not believing you are better than others. It is no longer needing other people to constantly confirm your worth. Chapter 8. Setting boundaries without guilt. One of the hardest things emotionally conditioned people ever learn is this: saying no does not make you cruel. And yet, for many people, setting boundaries feels terrifying. Not uncomfortable. Terrifying. Their chest tightens. Anxiety rises. Guilt appears instantly. Why? Because boundaries threaten approval. And for nervous systems conditioned around acceptance, approval feels emotionally tied to safety. This is why many people say yes when they desperately want to say no. Yes to exhausting responsibilities. Yes to emotional disrespect. Yes to unhealthy relationships. Yes to overextending themselves. Yes to situations destroying their peace internally. Not because they truly want to. Because disappointing others feels emotionally dangerous. Many people learned this pattern early in life. As children, they may have been taught, good people do not upset others. Being selfish is wrong. You should always help. Avoid conflict. Keep everyone happy. Some children were emotionally punished for boundaries. If they expressed needs, they were ignored. If they said no, they were guilted. If they disagreed, they were criticized. So the nervous system adapted. The child learned, to stay emotionally safe, I must prioritize others' comfort over my own needs. This becomes people-pleasing adulthood. The person constantly manages emotions of others, expectations of others, reactions of others, comfort of others, while abandoning themselves internally. And eventually, exhaustion appears. Because self-abandonment always has psychological consequences. Resentment grows silently. Burnout grows quietly. Emotional numbness appears slowly. Why? Because no human being can survive long-term without honoring their own emotional limits. Boundaries protect psychological health, not ego. Health. They define What behavior is acceptable, what emotional treatment is tolerable, what energy you can realistically give, what protects your nervous system without boundaries. Identity becomes consumed by external demands. The person loses themselves trying to maintain approval. This is especially common in emotionally sensitive individuals. Sensitive people often become hyper-aware of others' feelings. They fear hurting people, disappointing people, appearing rude, creating conflict, being misunderstood. So they tolerate situations damaging their peace internally. And over time, they begin feeling emotionally trapped. Because saying yes externally while feeling no internally creates psychological tension. The body feels this contradiction. Anxiety increases. Resentment increases. Emotional exhaustion increases. Many people secretly believe boundaries will make them unlovable. The nervous system says, if I stop overgiving, people will leave. If I stop pleasing everyone, I will lose connection. If I prioritize myself, I am selfish. These beliefs create emotional guilt. But guilt does not always mean you are doing something wrong. Sometimes guilt means you are doing something unfamiliar. Especially if you were conditioned to prioritize everyone except yourself. This is one of the most important realizations in emotional healing. Healthy boundaries often feel uncomfortable before they feel empowering. Why? Because the nervous system is learning a new emotional reality. I can disappoint people and still deserve love. I can say no without becoming cruel. Protecting my peace is not selfish. Other people's emotions are not always my responsibility. These lessons transform identity deeply. Because people without boundaries often become emotionally dependent on approval. Their worth comes from usefulness. Being needed becomes identity. Helping becomes emotional survival. This creates dangerous relationships, especially with emotionally manipulative people. Manipulative individuals often react negatively when boundaries appear. Why? Because boundaries remove access. The people who benefited from your self-abandonment may call you selfish, difficult, cold, changed, uncaring. This creates emotional confusion for recovering people pleasers. The mind wonders, am I becoming a bad person? But emotionally healthy boundaries are not cruelty. They are self-respect. There is a major psychological difference between being kind and abandoning yourself for approval. Kindness is genuine care. Self-abandonment is fear-based compliance. One comes from love. The other comes from emotional survival. This distinction changes everything. Emotionally mature people understand. Compassion does not require self-destruction. They can care deeply, support others, remain empathetic, stay emotionally open, while still protecting their nervous system. That balance is emotional health, not emotional coldness. Many people fear boundaries because they fear conflict itself. Conflict activates older emotional wounds. A child raised around unstable anger may associate disagreement with danger. So even small confrontation creates nervous system panic. The body reacts automatically, heart racing, over-explaining, apologizing excessively, shutting down, giving in quickly. Not because the person lacks intelligence. Because survival conditioning activates. Healing requires slowly teaching the body. Conflict is uncomfortable, not catastrophic. Disagreement does not automatically mean rejection. I can survive disappointing people. This creates emotional resilience. And surprisingly, healthy boundaries improve relationships. Why? Because resentment decreases, authenticity increases, emotional honesty grows. Relationships built entirely around self-sacrifice eventually become emotionally unstable. One person keeps overgiving. The other keeps taking, until exhaustion destroys connection. Boundaries interrupt this cycle. They create clarity, mutual respect, emotional balance. The healthiest people are not those who never care about others. They are people who care about others without abandoning themselves. That distinction matters deeply. Because emotionally free people no longer build identity entirely around being liked. They stop asking, how do I keep everyone happy? and begin asking, what allows me to remain emotionally honest and psychologically healthy? That question changes life profoundly. Because eventually, you realize, no matter how kind you are, someone will still misunderstand you. No matter how much you give, someone will still want more. No matter how carefully you explain yourself, someone may still feel disappointed. And trying to avoid disappointing everyone is psychologically impossible. This realization creates freedom, not selfishness. Freedom. The freedom to remain compassionate, without constantly betraying yourself. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this. Every boundary you set teaches your nervous system that your peace, needs, and emotional well-being matter too. Chapter 9. Becoming emotionally free. Most people spend their entire lives trying to control perception. Trying to control how they are seen, how they are judged, how they are remembered, how they are accepted. But emotional freedom begins when you realize something painful. You cannot control people's opinions completely. No matter how carefully you behave, someone will misunderstand you. No matter how kind you are, someone will criticize you. No matter how authentic you become, someone will reject you. This truth terrifies many people initially, because the nervous system wants certainty, wants approval, wants emotional safety. But trying to control every opinion creates psychological imprisonment. The person becomes emotionally dependent on perception, always monitoring reactions, approval, criticism, social acceptance, validation. This creates chronic nervous system tension, because external perception constantly changes, and identities built entirely around external approval become emotionally fragile. Emotionally free people understand something different. Other people's opinions are information, not identity. That distinction changes life completely. Because emotionally trapped people absorb every opinion personally. A criticism becomes, I am worthless. A rejection becomes, I am unlovable. Disagreement becomes, I am unsafe. Their nervous system treats external reactions as proof of personal value. But emotional freedom weakens this dependency. The person slowly realizes, someone misunderstanding me does not erase who I am. Someone disliking me does not make me bad. Someone rejecting me does not destroy my worth. These beliefs create internal stability, not arrogance, not emotional numbness, stability. The kind that allows someone to remain authentic without collapsing under judgment. This is why emotionally free people stop performing constantly. They stop editing every part of themselves for approval. Not because they become careless, because they become grounded. There is a major difference. Carelessness says, nobody matters. Emotional freedom says, people matter, but I will not abandon myself for acceptance. This distinction is everything. Many wounded people swing between extremes. First, they overcare about opinions. Then they try becoming emotionally cold, detached, unreachable, unbothered. But emotional numbness is not healing. It is protection. Real emotional freedom still allows empathy, connection, vulnerability, love, compassion. The difference is, emotionally free people no longer need constant external validation to feel worthy. This changes relationships deeply. The emotionally dependent person constantly asks, do you approve of me? Am I enough for you? Will you leave me? The emotionally free person asks, can I remain honest and connected to myself inside this relationship? One seeks identity externally. The other maintains identity internally. This creates healthier attachment. Because emotionally free people stop begging for worth through relationships. They stop chasing unavailable people, tolerating disrespect, shrinking themselves for acceptance, abandoning boundaries to avoid rejection, not because they stopped caring, because they started valuing themselves too. This also changes how people experience loneliness. Many individuals fear being alone because solitude forces confrontation with the self. Without distraction, without validation, Without performance, the person suddenly faces insecurity, emptiness, fear, unresolved wounds, so they escape constantly through social media, relationships, attention, busyness, approval seeking, overworking, anything to avoid internal silence. But emotionally free people slowly become comfortable with themselves. Not perfectly, but honestly. They stop needing constant distraction to feel valuable. Stillness no longer feels terrifying. Solitude no longer feels like worthlessness. This creates inner peace, because the nervous system stops depending entirely on external stimulation for emotional stability. Freedom also changes how people handle judgment. Most people waste enormous emotional energy trying to be universally understood, explaining endlessly, defending themselves constantly, trying to control perception. But emotional freedom accepts a difficult truth. Some people will create versions of you in their minds that have nothing to do with reality. And you cannot control that completely. This realization saves emotional energy, because eventually, emotionally mature people stop trying to win every misunderstanding. They stop fighting endlessly for universal approval. Not because they become passive, because they realize peace is more valuable than constant emotional performance. This is especially important for sensitive people. Sensitive individuals often overabsorb emotional reactions from others. They replay conversations, analyze expressions, overthink criticism, internalize tension. Their nervous system becomes emotionally overloaded by external perception. Healing requires learning emotional separation, not disconnection. Separation. The ability to recognize this person's reaction belongs partly to their own psychology too. People project constantly their fears, their wounds, their insecurities, their expectations. Not every opinion reflects objective truth. Emotionally free people understand this deeply, so they stop giving every voice equal authority over their nervous system. This creates emotional calmness. Not because judgment disappears, because identity becomes more internally anchored. And perhaps the most powerful transformation happens here. The person finally stops living as performance, stops asking, "How do I appear?" and begins asking, "Am I living honestly?" That shift changes everything, because performance creates anxiety. Authenticity creates peace. Performance requires constant monitoring. Authenticity creates internal alignment. Performance fears rejection constantly. Authenticity accepts that rejection is part of being real. This does not mean authenticity is always easy. Sometimes honesty costs approval. Sometimes boundaries disappoint people. Sometimes truth creates misunderstanding. But emotionally free people realize losing yourself is more painful than losing approval. That realization changes identity forever. The nervous system slowly learns, I do not need universal acceptance to deserve respect. I can survive being misunderstood. I can feel rejection without becoming worthless. I can remain compassionate without abandoning myself. This is emotional freedom. Not becoming untouchable. Not becoming superior. Not pretending opinions never hurt. Real freedom is quieter than that. It is the ability to stay connected to yourself, even when the world does not fully approve. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this: emotional freedom begins the moment you stop building your identity around being accepted by everyone. Chapter 10. The day you stop explaining yourself to everyone, there comes a moment in emotional healing that feels strangely uncomfortable. Not dramatic. Not loud. Quiet. A moment when you stop feeling the need to explain every part of yourself. Every decision. Every boundary. Every emotion. Every choice. And for people conditioned around approval, this moment feels almost unnatural. Because for years, they survived through explanation. Explaining to avoid conflict. Explaining to avoid rejection. Explaining to avoid disappointing people. Explaining to prove they were good. The nervous system believed, if people fully understand me, maybe they will not leave. If I explain enough, maybe they will approve. If I justify myself perfectly, maybe I will be accepted. So the person develops a habit of over-explaining, over-defending, over-proving. Not because they are dishonest. Because they are afraid of being misunderstood. But eventually, emotional exhaustion appears. Because constantly defending your humanity is psychologically draining. Especially when some people are committed to misunderstanding you anyway. This realization changes something deeply inside the nervous system. Not every misunderstanding needs correction. Not every opinion deserves access to your emotional energy. Emotionally immature people often demand endless explanations because they believe boundaries require permission. Emotionally healthy people understand something different. Your peace does not require universal agreement. This is difficult for approval-conditioned individuals to accept. Because they spent years believing, if someone is upset with me, I must fix it immediately. So they apologize excessively. Explain endlessly. Try desperately to control perception. But emotional freedom requires tolerating discomfort sometimes. Including being misunderstood, disappointing people, not receiving approval. Allowing others to have incomplete opinions about you. This does not mean becoming cruel or dismissive. It means recognizing an important truth. You cannot build a peaceful life while constantly trying to manage everyone's emotional reactions. Some people will judge your boundaries. Some people will dislike your growth. Some people preferred the version of you that over-sacrificed itself for their comfort. And when you change, they may call you selfish, distant, cold, different, difficult. Not because you became harmful. Because the relationship dynamic changed. The version of you that tolerated everything no longer exists. This creates emotional discomfort. Especially for people who built identity around being easy to love. But healing often requires becoming willing to disappoint people who only valued your self-abandonment. That sentence is uncomfortable. But psychologically important. Because many individuals confuse being liked with being respected. They are not always the same thing. Some people like you most when you never say no, you never challenge them, you never prioritize yourself, you never create inconvenience. But relationships built entirely around self-erasure are emotionally unstable. Eventually, resentment appears. Exhaustion appears. Invisible anger appears. Why? Because the authentic self cannot survive permanent suppression. This is why emotional maturity changes communication. The emotionally dependent person says, "Please understand why I need this boundary." The emotionally grounded person says, "I understand you may not like this boundary, but I still need it." That difference is profound. One asks permission for self-respect. The other practices self-respect calmly. This shift also changes how people experience guilt. At first, boundaries create anxiety. The nervous system panics. What if they leave? What if they become angry? What if they think badly of me? But over time, something surprising happens. The body begins realizing, I survived. The world did not collapse. Disapproval is uncomfortable, not deadly. And slowly, emotional courage develops. Not fearlessness. Courage. The ability to remain honest despite discomfort. This is one of the biggest transformations in healing. The person stops organizing their entire identity around avoiding negative reactions. They stop shape-shifting constantly. Stop performing constantly. Stop emotionally negotiating their worth with everyone around them. Instead, they begin living more truthfully, more directly, more peacefully. And perhaps the most liberating realization of all is this: people do not need to fully understand your healing for your healing to remain valid. Some people will never understand your boundaries, your sensitivity, your exhaustion, your growth, your emotional needs, and that is okay. Because emotional maturity is not learning how to make everyone approve of you. It is learning how to remain connected to yourself even when approval is absent. That is freedom. Quiet freedom. The kind that no longer needs constant permission to exist honestly. Conclusion. You were never meant to live as a performance at some point in life. Most people forget who they are. Not completely, but slowly, quietly, piece by piece. They begin shaping themselves around approval, expectations, judgment, social acceptance, fear of rejection. And eventually, performance becomes identity. The person smiles while exhausted, agrees while resentful, performs confidence while insecure, appears strong while emotionally overwhelmed. The world praises the mask. Meanwhile, the real self disappears underneath it. This is one of the greatest tragedies of modern life. Many people are deeply connected to public perception, while deeply disconnected from themselves. Because the fear of judgment changes people psychologically. It teaches them to suppress emotions, to hide flaws, to avoid vulnerability, to seek constant validation, to prioritize acceptance over authenticity, and over time, they stop asking, "Who am I really?" and begin asking, "What version of me will be accepted?" This creates emotional exhaustion, because performance requires constant nervous system monitoring, constant editing, constant comparison, constant self-protection. The body never fully relaxes when authenticity feels unsafe. That is why so many people secretly feel anxious, disconnected, and emotionally tired. Not because they are weak, because they are carrying identities built around survival instead of truth. But healing changes this. Not instantly. Slowly. The nervous system begins learning something new. I do not need to perform constantly to deserve connection. I can survive disapproval. I can be imperfect and still worthy. I do not need universal approval to respect myself. These realizations create emotional freedom. Not the freedom of becoming cold. Not the freedom of pretending opinions never hurt. Human beings naturally care about relationships, care about belonging, care about connection. The goal was never emotional numbness. The goal was internal stability. The ability to remain connected to yourself even when approval is uncertain. That is real confidence. Real confidence is not loud. It is not arrogance. It is not superiority. It is quiet self-trust. The kind that says, "I may not be accepted by everyone, but I will not abandon myself anymore." That sentence changes everything psychologically. Because many people spend years betraying themselves for approval. Laughing when uncomfortable, saying yes when exhausted, staying silent when hurt, pretending when emotionally disconnected. Why? Because rejection felt more frightening than self-abandonment. But eventually, emotionally healthy people realize something painful. Losing yourself hurts more than losing approval. This realization becomes the beginning of authenticity. And authenticity transforms life. Relationships become more honest. Boundaries become clearer. Anxiety decreases. Overthinking softens. The nervous system relaxes. Why? Because internal conflict decreases. The performative self and authentic self begin reconnecting. This does not mean life becomes free from criticism, or rejection, or misunderstanding. No human being escapes those experiences completely. Some people will still judge you unfairly. Some people will misunderstand your intentions. Some people will dislike your boundaries. Some people will reject the real version of you. But emotionally free people stop allowing those reactions to define identity completely. They understand. Other people's opinions are not the final authority over my worth. This creates peace. Not perfect peace, human peace. The kind that allows someone to speak honestly, love openly, exist authentically, make mistakes, remain imperfect, stay emotionally real, without collapsing under judgment constantly. That is freedom. And perhaps the most important part of healing is this: you stop fighting yourself. You stop treating sensitivity like weakness. You stop treating vulnerability like failure. You stop treating humanity like something embarrassing. Instead, you begin accepting yourself more honestly. The confident parts, the insecure parts, The healing parts, the fearful parts, the growing parts, not with shame, with awareness, with compassion. Because true self-worth is not built through perfection. It is built through self-acceptance. And self-acceptance changes everything. The person no longer needs endless applause to feel valuable. No longer needs constant validation to feel worthy. No longer needs to shape-shift for every room. The nervous system finally begins resting. Because authenticity no longer feels like danger. This is what emotional maturity ultimately creates. The courage to exist truthfully. Not perfectly. Truthfully. And perhaps the deepest realization waiting at the end of this journey is this: you were never meant to spend your entire life performing for an invisible audience. You were meant to become fully alive as yourself.